All right, let's get started. Where's the time gone? We only have 2 weeks left in the semester, so let's have a look and see where we're going. We've got 2 weeks left, and we have 1, 2, 3, 4 lectures to go. I think we should be able to get through the rest of the lecture material. We're looking at this final theme of optimizing both the body plan of the robot, the shape, the number of legs, the distribution of sensors and motors, along with the neural network that controls the robot. We'll finish our discussion today about the first attempt to do this back in the early 1990s by computer graphics researcher Carl Sims. We'll look at L-system robots today, another attempt to evolve bodies and brains. And then we will probably get partway through lecture 25 today, which is why do this in the first place? It's a much more complicated experiment or optimization problem to optimize both the body plan and the robot and the brain. Why don't we just pick a robot and try and optimize a controller for it? We'll spend a little bit of time talking about that today. Next week, Thursday and next week, we'll carry on with robots that can adapt like animals, and we'll return to soft robots with a guest lecture on the final day by another former student who took this class, Nick Cheney. We will then have a week between the last lecture and our exam, which will take place here. I don't pick the place or the time, so I realize 8:30 is already early for some of us. We will be here at 7:30 in the morning on Thursday, May 11th, and you will have between 3 and 4 minutes to present or summarize your final project. Obviously, that's not a lot of time. We will talk more about that next week. Any other questions about where we're going, expectations? Okay, let's talk about the final project again. A number of additional issues that have come up. A couple of you have emailed me about the new version of PyroSim, so I put up this separate GitHub repo called PyroSim 2 New Features. Some of you have downloaded that and have not been able to instantiate one of those 2 features, which is the updated collision detection and resolution. So now in the new version of PyroSim, if 2 objects come in contact with one another, they should not interpenetrate, with the exception of pairs of objects that are attached together with a joint. Some of you have found that the new version of PyroSim is not doing that. I went through the repo carefully, and it may be the case that's true for some of you on some platforms. What I would suggest is if you're having this problem, delete your local version of PyroSim 2 New Features, re-download it and reinstall it according to the instructions at the bottom of the page. I've made a few changes which hopefully will fix that problem. If you're having this problem, you download PyroSim 2 New Features, you reinstall it, and you still see that pairs of objects are interpenetrating one another that should not, please email me back. I'd like to know. Also, if it fixes the problem, please let me know. Again, it's hard for us to debug whether things are working for every combination of platform and version of Python and so on. So let us know whether it's working or not. Some of you are adding ray sensors to your robots, and you've been trying to add more than one ray sensor to an object, and it's not working. I went back and checked into that. It's obvious in retrospect that it's not working because each object in PyroSim only allows you to embed at most one sensor of each type. So an object can contain a touch sensor and a ray sensor, but it cannot contain 2 touch sensors or 2 ray sensors. So if you're trying to add vision to your robot and you want to have multiple ray sensors, you're going to have to create additional objects or embed the ray sensors in the objects that you already have. Yes?
I found for my robot that I was able to put multiple ray sensors in a single object. It seemed to be working fine for me.
Okay, I would love to see your code then. Let's talk about this offline. Okay. Yes?
I had originally done that as well, but I was having issues with my sensor data, so I didn't know. That was for a different issue, but I was able to embed it. I don't know if you're getting sensor.
You mean you embedded it as in you didn't get any error messages?
No,
Did you actually see the multiple ray sensors being drawn from an object?
Yeah.
Yeah, I had the same thing.
Did you capture sensor data back from the multiple ray sensors?
I haven't looked at it, but
Okay. It may be that it's drawing the multiple ray sensors, but not capturing the actual data back from the. And I guess maybe we should look at this offline, but let's check. I would say just to be safe, if you need multiple ray sensors, just add additional objects to your robot. It'll slow your simulation down a little bit, but I think for most of you it shouldn't be too much of a problem. Other questions? Okay, one other thing to talk about is if you're trying to evolve more than one robot in a simulation, some of you are doing predator-prey, some of you are evolving pairs of robots that try and manipulate or carry an object together. How do you determine the fitness value of one of the robots that exists in a simulation that contains more than one robot? We were actually talking, or this came up in lecture 23 last week when we were talking about Carl Sims's work on evolving virtual creatures, and we ended last time with this figure, which demonstrates the 7 different ways that Dr. Sims tried to evolve robots that were competing over this common resource, right? So let's have a look at the 5th variation up here. So in this case, we have 2 populations of robots, and each robot in each population is evaluated against every robot in the other population, right? How would you compute the fitness of that robot in the top left of panel E? That robot has been evaluated in N simulations, and in each of those N simulations, it was exposed to one robot from the other population. What would its fitness be? So the actual fitness that we went through last time, for example, if we're talking about F1 in the first population and it's being evaluated against another robot from the other population, which is F2, R1's fitness is how close it gets to the cube and how far it can keep creature 2 from the cube. But that's just the fitness of robot 1 relative to robot 2, right? In situation E up here, we have robot 1 in the top left. We have robot 1 in the top left, and it was just competed against robot 2, and we compete F1. But then we're also going to compete it against this robot. We're going to have to recompute its fitness, then its fitness against this one, and so on and so forth. How do we compute the fitness of robot 1?
do you mean like you just have robot 1 and robot 2 go into the arena, and then you just calculate the distance of the cube from the area, or from the zone?
That's right. So that's a starting point, right? So we put robot 1 and robot 2 in the same simulation, in the same arena, and we can compute F1 and F2. But we're not done computing the fitness of robot 1, because now we need to compete robot 1 against, let's call this robot 3, robot 4. Normalize it how?
I think I see 6 nodes to just take the fitnesses and multiply them.
We could just add them up, right? Take the average. What is robot 1's average ability against all the other robots in the other population? So let's try and write this in shorthand here. We want to compute the fitness of robot 1. We can compete robot 1 against robot 2, and that'll give us back, let's call it F sub 1, 2. This is how well robot 1 did against robot 2. But we also want to compete it against robot 3, so we're going to compute F1, 3, F1, 4, F1, 5, and so on. And then maybe we take the mean across all of those. So we compute this inner fitness and then take the sum, where we're going to iterate now over, I'll just write this as 2n, just to keep this simple for the moment, over all the other robots in the other population, and then divide by, in this case, n minus 1. So in this case, we're simulating F1 competing against robots 2 through N, right? So if you're, again, trying to evolve robot swarms or pairs of robots that are working against one another, like in Sims's case, or working together, whatever you're using for this inner fitness computation, you might need to record it for multiple simulations and then take the average to understand, on average, how well does robot 1 do against or with a bunch of other robots. This is really not that different from when we were looking at phototaxis and we were taking the average behavior of the robot in 4 different environments. In this case, the different environments from the point of view of robot 1 are environments that contain different robots. Make sense? Okay, so let's get back to lecture then. So again, talking about Carl Sims, this was the first attempt to try and evolve robot bodies and brains. He created a particular genotype to phenotype map. Remember, the genotype is the blueprint that describes how to construct the phenotype, the thing for which we're going to compute fitness. In our case, the phenotype is usually a robot. He used a particular genotype, which was encoded in a particular data structure, which is a nested, directed multigraph. What's a multigraph?
A graph of multiple connections between nodes.
Right, so here's an example of multiple edges, which indicate that this body segment should have 2 legs constructed on either side. The directed part means the directed edges, and that just tells us build this part, then follow this directed edge to this node, which will tell us how to build this part. What about the nested part? So in the genotypes we're seeing here, we're not seeing the nested part. Why are the genotypes nested multigraphs? What is a nested graph?
You mean like the loop back to the same node?
No, that would be recurrent connections here. That actually isn't mentioned in the 3 adjectives we have here. What is a nested graph? The neural network, right? So these genotypes over here, right? This is a graph. The big circles and the big arrows represent nodes and edges. And inside each node is more graph material, right? Smaller circles, smaller nodes, and thin edges here. And they're representing, as we translate the genotype into the body, every time we visit this outer node contains a number of parameters that tell us how to build this piece in the simulation. And the graph material inside that node, that's nested inside that node, tells us how to build a little bit of neural structure inside that part, and how to wire up this neural structure with neural structure in neighboring parts of the body. Right? So by translating the genotype, these multigraphs, into phenotypes, we get information about how to build both the body and the brain together. Right? We didn't really talk about mutation too much here. Let's go back to the nested graph. But the mutation operators can make changes to the graph as a whole. So maybe a mutation adds a whole new node and adds an edge to it, which is adding a new part to this robot. Or maybe it's modifying some of the information, some of the parameters inside this node. So maybe a mutation elongates or shortens or widens this block. Mutations might also modify the nested graph material. If a mutation makes a change to any of the inner graph material, what's the repercussion for the phenotype? What change occurs in the child robot? Nothing? Depends. If we were to add or delete a node in here, inside this node, what would happen to the robot, the phenotype? Remember that the inner graph material here is is describing how to build the neural network, the controller inside the robot. So for example, in this node over here, we have two motor neurons that connect to the first joint and the second joint. Oh, sorry, these are the motor neurons over here, the effector neurons that affect effector 1 and effector 2. This is the joint sensor, first joint sensor and the second joint sensor. What happens if a mutation affects, for example, this edge, changes this edge?
The robot would behave differently?
The robot would behave differently because the child creature will look exactly the same as the parent. We haven't made any change to the outer graph. The mutation hasn't changed the body. The mutation has just made a change to the synaptic weight that connects the second joint sensor to the first motor neuron. Where does that change show up in the creature? The behavior is going to change because we're changing how a sensor influences a motor. But where does that change occur inside the body of this robot?
Is it going to affect both wings on one of the body segments?
All four wings, actually, right? Remember that this node here constructs this piece, this piece, this piece, and this piece. So although a mutation is only changing one piece of the genotype, that change is going to show up in here, in here, in here, and in here, which means each of these four wings or four fins are going to move differently in response to the angle of that fin at a given point in time. Make sense? Okay. So again, it's a relatively complicated setup here, right? Because we have genetic material, which is dictating the body of the robot and the brain of the robot. And a mutation to the genotype on the left side might change the body, but leave the brain untouched. Or vice versa, as we just saw, a mutation might affect the neural controller of the robot, but leave the body unaffected. Okay. Okay, so we ended last time with this specific example of taking these two robots and competing them against a common resource. We looked at the two fitness functions, which are relative to each other. So robot 1 is only as good as its own behavior and its ability to frustrate the behavior of its antagonist, and vice versa. We looked again at different ways to compete these robots against one another and evaluate them either in a single population, the left side here, or create two populations of robots and populate robots from one population against robots in the other population. Okay, we'll end this lecture with just some visualizations of, again, evolutionary behavior over time. This is not that different from what you've seen before. We have 4 separate evolutionary runs that were performed, where the horizontal axis is showing us evolutionary time, generations elapsing over time, and the height is, the height of the line represents the fitness of the best robot in that population at a time. All of the fitness curve graphs that we've seen so far, fitness is always going up over time. That's no longer true. Why?
Because if they both can't go up.
They both can't go up, right?
Competing will both be up.
Exactly. So these 4 evolutionary runs were performed using this setup down here, G, where we have these 2 separate populations. In the figure, it's the black population and the gray population. What happens in the topmost run, in run A?
Looks like species 1 has a decent head start, but then species 2 beats it out for 25-ish generations.
Yep.
And species 1 takes a very strong lead. And species 2 at generation 75 takes over species 1, but species 1 overtakes it again.
There you go, our first evolutionary robotics color commentator. Well done, thank you. Right, if you go back and watch the Carl Sims video, that's exactly what you see. And this is what you see also in populations of co-evolving organisms, right? The lions come up with a new strategy to bring down gazelles. The gazelles that managed to survive produce some offspring which, through evolutionary chance, know, quote unquote, how to evade the lions, which increases incentive evolutionary pressure on the lions to figure out a new way to bring down the gazelles, and vice versa, right? That's exactly what you're seeing in panel A. This is sometimes known in evolutionary biology as the Red Queen effect. Why the Red Queen?
Alice in Wonderland.
What did the Red Queen do in Alice in Wonderland?
Attempted to behead Alice.
What's that?
Attempted to behead Alice.
Yes, that's true, among other things. That's not the reference here. A little rusty on your classic literature. Everybody remember? Sam, you should remember.
Yeah, you have to run, just stay in the same place.
Absolutely, right? A great metaphor for modern life, right? You have to run as fast as you can to at least stay even with everyone else, right? That's exactly the situation if you're a member of a evolving population that's competing against another evolving population. The gray individuals in the gray population are doing a little bit better at capturing the cube than individuals in the black population until some mutation occurs in the black population that produces a superior strategy. Takes another 20 or so generations until a mutation occurs in the gray population that produces a new strategy, and so on. What about panel B? Exactly the same evolutionary setup. Everything is exactly the same. They just went back to generation 0 and seeded it with a new set of random robots. What happens in this case?
Okay.
Give us the summary.
Summary. Species 1 gets started out with a very lucky generation for the first, 6, and then species 2 quickly overtakes it.
And never to be recovered, right? Things didn't work out too well for the gray population. Things were even worse in the third evolutionary run, right? There was some strategy that individuals in the black population hit on that could never be superseded by the gray individuals. However, if we kept running this long enough, perhaps they would. And again, in the fourth run, we get back to the Red Queen effect, and we see this rich evolutionary dynamics where one population is on top for a few generations, and then it switches.
So is the reason that the species kind of look like a reflection of each other, is that because their fitness is directly based off of their comparison to each other?
Absolutely, right?
Yeah.
So these two fitness functions are symmetric, right? So if one individual does slightly better, it means by definition the other individual did worse. The closer I get to the cube, the lower your fitness value. The further you can push me away from the cube, the higher your fitness goes up. Right? Exactly. Some of you might have noticed when you're running your own evolutionary simulations that there's a lot of fitness improvement in the first few generations, and then what happens? Plateaus, right? There isn't a lot of evolutionary improvement. Turns out that this is an interesting thing to build into your evolutionary simulation, not just because it's more biologically accurate, but by introducing this Red Queen effect, you make the evolutionary dynamics in your simulation richer, and with a few exceptions, like this one, often you get, from one generation to the next, a lot of change in the kind of behaviors that are evolving. So again, for those of you that are evolving multiple robots together, this might be something to look for or try and visualize in your simulations. Okay, any questions about Carl Sims's work before we move on? Okay, so let's move on now to lecture 24, L-System Robots. In this lecture, we're going to actually see two older pieces of computer science incorporated into an evolutionary robotics experiment. The first piece we're going to incorporate into the experiment, or that Hornby and Pollock did, was turtle graphics. And turtle graphics dates all the way back almost to the beginning of computers, back in the 60s and 70s. There were attempts to introduce this new computer technology into schools, and a way to introduce programming into schools. And the idea here was to imagine a turtle And this turtle possesses state. So we know the position of the turtle, its orientation. It's sitting on a page facing in a particular direction, and the turtle is holding a pen, and it's either holding the pen to the paper or lifting the pen off the paper.
I remember doing this.
I remember doing this, and my professor remembers doing this. This is a hallowed tradition in computer science, right? Way back at the beginning, people realized that for a lot of people, trying to teach coding is somewhat an abstract enterprise, kind of hard to wrap your mind around what coding is. So turtle graphics was a way to try and concretize this, right? Imagine this turtle holding a pen, and you can then tell the turtle what to do, right? For example, we could tell the turtle to move forward 10 paces, turn left 90 degrees, drop the pen, move forward, lift the pen, and so on. There's our code. We've got 5 lines of code. Those 5 lines of code do not produce this picture on the left. What does? For those of you that remember turtle graphics, can you write the code in your head that produces this picture? I'll help you a little bit. Let's assume the turtle starts in the middle here rather than out here at the edge. What do you need to tell the turtle to do to draw this picture?
Drop pen, move, turn,
Turn.
move, turn, move, turn.
So definitely move, turn, move, turn, move, turn. And there's 500 lines here. Are you going to write 500 lines of code to do this?
For loop.
For loop, right? Exactly. So it's kind of onerous to write all this out manually, so you can introduce the idea of iteration, right? Okay, move, turn, move, turn, move, turn. Move forward 1 unit plus a function of the iterator here, I. Why do we do that? Why not just move a constant distance? You'd make a square rather than an expanding spiral, right? We need to make a longer line every time through the loop. And we're always going to turn not 90 degrees, but slightly less than 90 degrees, which gives you this spiral pattern, right? Okay, that's turtle graphics. We're going to come back to that in a moment. That's the first piece we need for this experiment today. The second piece is going to be formal grammars, which some of you may remember from your CS classes. So just as a refresher here, a formal grammar, we have an alphabet or a set, if you like, uppercase V, and this set contains a number of variables. In order to define a formal grammar, we need these variables, and we also need a starting quote-unquote sentence. And we can create a starting sentence to be anything as long as it's made up of elements from V, our variables. So let's assume we have 2 variables, A and B. We put them next to one another, and that's our starting sentence. We can then define an arbitrary number of production rules. So in this case, we have 2 production rules. Each production rule has a predecessor to the left of the arrow and a successor to the right of the arrow. And what that basically means is in your current string, walk from your current, start at the left of your string and work from the left to the right. Every time you see something, if that matches your predecessor, delete the predecessor and replace it with the successor. Hopefully this is sounding familiar to some of you. Okay. We can also include in V constants as well as variables. If we see a symbol in our growing sentences that do not match any of our predecessors, then they're constants. They sort of mean you're done. Don't apply any of the production rules at this point in the growing string. Okay, so we've defined our variables, our starting sentence, our production rules. We've also identified some constants. We now take our starting sentence, we apply our production rules until the sentence only contains constants. There's nowhere left in the string where we can actually apply our production rules, and we return this final sentence, right? That's a formal grammar. We can do lots of different things with formal grammars. One of the things you can do, and this was realized by Aristide Lindenmayer, who was a biologist, he realized you could actually use these formal grammars to define biological processes. And the surprising thing at the time, which made what became known as Lindenmayer systems, or L systems for short, is that with a relatively simple formal grammar, you could replicate or you could simulate biological processes. Here's one example that I pulled off the Wikipedia page for L systems. Here's a formal grammar at the top, and this formal grammar simulates the growth of algae. So let's boil down the life cycle of algae to just two variables, uppercase A for the adult form of the algae, and uppercase B for the bud, which cannot reproduce. It has to grow into an adult. Okay, so let's now define two production rules to simulate how an individual algae changes over its lifetime. An adult, A, can produce a bud which is attached to it, so A becomes AB. And a bud, a young algae, over time can slowly mature into an adult algae capable of reproduction. That's it. Okay, so now we take a single algae at time step 0. At time step 1, it produces a bud. So we have our starting sentence here. That matches this predecessor. So we delete this A and replace it with the successor AB. So we now have an adult that's produced a bud at time 1. At time 2, we visit this string. We have an adult. So again, we delete this A and we replace it with AB. We also have our B here, and we see that B matches this production rule. So we delete this B and replace it with A, and we now have ABA. And what happens as we simulate this growing algae colony forward in time? What biological phenomenon is occurring here? Reproduction is occurring. We built that in though, right? We put reproduction in. There's something new that's appeared now that we've simulated or run our L system. Not quite. What kind of reproduction is occurring here? How is this algae colony growing over time? Asexually, actually, because we just have an adult which produces a bud. We don't have two parent algae producing offspring. Look at the length of these strings from one time step to the next. What's occurring here?
Is it that the adults are eventually going to outnumber the buds considerably?
That may be true. That's an interesting point. I don't know if the ratio of A to B changes over time. That would be an interesting thing to measure. What else is going on here?
It's growing exponentially.
It's growing exponentially, right? So most biological species, as long as they're sufficiently safe and at a comfortable temperature and they have unlimited resources, what happens? They grow exponentially, right? That's not built in here anywhere, right? It just occurs by running the cell system forward. And this is what was so exciting about Lindenmayer systems when they were first invented. With a very, very simple biological model, it's hard to imagine a simpler biological model, it produces predictions that match reality. This model says, if this is how you're going to model the growth of algae, when you simulate or run this model, it's going to predict that real algae will grow exponentially. Right? This model is sort of hiding limited resources or infinite resources. That's not built into the model, but you can clearly see it. Right? Okay, so we can apply Lindenmayer systems to all kinds of biological species. We can also sort of treat this in an abstract sense by bringing together now turtle graphics with a formal grammar, a Lindenmayer system, where now the final sentence that we get, whatever that final sentence is, we're going to treat the elements of that sentence as commands to our turtle. So let's define a new formal system. We're going to have two different variables. Our start sentence is A, and we're going to define two production rules. Wherever we see A, we replace it with ABA. Wherever we see B, we replace it with BBB. which is going to give us a like we just saw in the algae example, it's going to give us a growing string of collections of A's and B's. We're going to then connect the turtle to our final sentence by walking from left to right along this final sentence. And whenever we see an A, that's a command to the turtle to move forward with the pen down. And wherever we see a B, that means move forward with the pen up. So there's only two things that the turtle can do here: move forward and put the pen up or down. It cannot turn left or right, which means our turtle is going to move in a line. Let's say we take the starting string, A, which is one command: move forward with the pen down. That gives us this picture. If we take our starting string and we apply the production rule once, we get this picture. What sentence does this picture correspond to? ABA, right? So we had A. We found that in the production rule, so we replaced A with ABA. If we take that new sentence and send it to the turtle, it draws A, then B, then A. If we take ABA and we apply the two production rules again, we get this pattern. We have ABA. Our first production rule says replace the A with ABA. Our second production rule tells us to replace B with B, B, B. And the first production rule tells us to replace A with A, B, A. So the third line that you see there is pen down, pen up, pen down, pen up, pen up, pen up, pen down, pen up, pen down. Right? If we apply production rules again, we get this picture. Apply it again, we get this picture. Apply it again, we get this picture, which is a very specific fractal known as Cantor dust. Okay? So, turns out that if we take turtle graphics, which can produce all kinds of pretty pictures, and we combine it with a formal grammar, you tend to get fractals, self-similar patterns all the way down. Okay. Here's another Lindenmayer system, which is, again, attached to turtle graphics. We have slightly more variables now. We have F for draw forward, minus means turn left 25, plus means turn right, and X is a constant. It just means don't do anything. We're going to introduce two new variables, push and pop. So the way to think about push and pop is, let's imagine that we've already produced our sentence from our formal grammar. We have our turtle, which is here, and the command is F, draw forward. So our turtle draws forward. We then, actually let's draw out this string. We've just executed F. The turtle then encounters this variable, which means push the current position onto a stack. Next symbol means minus turn 25 degrees to the left, and the next symbol is F, so it draws the left branch. Then the next variable in the string is pop, which pops the turtle back to its previous state from the stack, which was that it was sitting here and facing forward. So we popped the state, and the turtle is reverted to this position. Next symbol is plus, turn 25 degrees to the right, and the final symbol is F. And this relatively short string gives us this relatively simple tree. Like we just saw with the Cantor dust, if you keep applying production rules to a growing string, you get branching structure which starts to look very much like what you see in nature. If you go back and read a little more deeply on Lindenmayer systems, Lindenmayer and then others after him created different kinds of formal grammars that produce pine trees, maple trees, bamboo forests. They can actually replicate the growth processes of particular plant species. It's a beautiful example at the intersection of computer science and biology. Okay, so what does all this have to do with robotics? We're going to do exactly the same thing, or Hornby and Pollock did exactly the same thing. They took a formal grammar and they attached a turtle to it, and then they took those two pieces and attached them to a physics engine. So now, when the turtle moves and draws, it doesn't draw a line, it drops an object into the physics engine. Basic idea. We're going to then evolve the actual formal grammar. So if a mutation makes a change to a formal grammar, it makes a change to what the turtle does, which makes a change to the robot that's created in the simulation. So like we just saw in Carl Sims's example, where we had a nested multigraph as the genotype, which is producing a simulated robot, now we still have our phenotype is still a simulated robot in a physics engine, but the genotype is an L system. Make sense? It's the basic idea. All right, let's look at a little bit of the details. So here are on the left side here, these are all of the variables that make up the formal grammar. We just saw push and pop. We also introduce another one, which is block. So any piece of a string that is in curly braces might now be repeated multiple times. We have forward, same thing, create a bar forward. Backward means move backwards along a bar. Don't drop your pen, just move back. Revolute 1 and Revolute 2 mean move forward, and you're moving forward along an object. Connect that object to its neighboring object with a revolute or a rotational joint. So as the turtle is moving along the lengths of cylinders that it's already created using the forward command, it's dropping joints along the way that attaches pairs of objects together. Revolute 1 means move forward and add a joint around the z-axis, right? So these are just the different joint normals. Or add Revolute 2, which is move forward and add a joint around the y-axis, right? So it can drop two different kinds of joints. The only difference between those two joints is the angle of the joint normal. Okay, so unlike our turtle that was drawing canter dust, which was moving along a line, the only thing that turtle could do is move forward and back. The turtle that was creating our simulated plant could move about in the two-dimensional plane. Now our turtle can move through three-dimensional space. So we have six different variables, up and down, turn left and right, or twist counterclockwise or clockwise. Change the orientation. We can change the orientation of the turtle in three-dimensional space. After it's changing its orientation and it receives a forward or backward command, it will move forward and backward given its current orientation. Make sense? You'll notice that some of these variables have an integer parameter associated with them. So turn down by n degrees, turn clockwise by n degrees, create a joint that has a motor associated with it that's going to oscillate at a certain frequency, repeat the block of variables inside the curly braces by n times, and so on. So this is an additional detail which we don't just have a formal grammar here, we have a parameterized formal grammar. And I will come back to that in a couple slides. Just hold on to that for a moment. Okay, so we now have a turtle that is drawing or constructing a robot according to a formal system. What are we missing?
Neural network.
The neural network. So as the turtle moves through three-dimensional space in the physics engine, it is also moving about inside the growing neural network of the robot. So this is a little bit hard to wrap your brain around because we have a single turtle but that turtle exists in two different places at the same time. So as it's moving through the string, it might encounter commands that move the turtle in the physics engine and cause it to construct parts of the robot. But the turtle might also encounter additional variables that cause it to move about inside the robot and create neural structure. So far, so good. A little bit non-intuitive, but kind of makes sense. Okay. When the first object is created by the turtle, by default, there's also a single neuron, A, created, and that single neuron has a single synapse that connects the neuron to itself. That synapse is in bold here, indicating that the turtle is sitting on the synapse. So the turtle can only ever sit on a synapse. It never sits on a neuron. And it can hop from one synapse to the next. So in panel A, in the top left, we have a simple neural network, one neuron, one synapse, and the turtle is sitting on the synapse. And remember that there is some sentence which is dictating how the turtle should move and what it should do. So for example, again, it might encounter open square bracket or close square bracket, which will push the state of the turtle in terms of the neural network. And the state of the turtle in terms of the neural network is which synapse is it sitting on. The only state that the turtle has is which synapse inside the neural network it's sitting on. Okay. If it encounters this variable, which has a parameter, it will subtract n from the current weight of the synapse. So if the turtle is sitting there, sees this command, it will decrease that synaptic weight. If it encounters, as we're moving from left to right along the string, the duplicate variable, it will create a new synapse that connects neuron A to neuron B, and it will hop to the new synapse it just created and paint that synapse with weight n. Okay. I won't read through the rest of these. Let's try and use the figures on the left to build up an intuition for how this works. Let's imagine we have the situation in panel A, and we're moving from left to right along this string, and the turtle encounters a particular variable here, which transforms network A into network B. Which variable did the turtle hit in the string? Split, right? This one down here. So split says create a new neuron C, and I apologize on behalf of the authors. They should have labeled this better. We've got neuron A. The new neuron here is, now let's see if I can figure this out. Attach edge from A to C. The new neuron is actually this new one called A. I apologize. Okay, so we've got this neuron here. We've split off this new neuron A at the top here, so we've created new neuron C. We've attached an edge from A to C, which was the original edge, and create a new edge that goes, I'm sorry, this is C, a new edge that goes from the new neuron to this one with weight n. So what it actually encountered is the variable split 0.8. Take the current neuron, the edge, take the neuron and split it, and then attach a new edge and jump to that new edge. Right? It's sitting on the edge 0.8 now. Which variable did it hit in the string that transforms network B into network C? Duplicate, right? So the turtle was sitting here, it duplicates this edge and gives it a new weight of 3.0 in this case. Which variable transformed this network into this network?
reverse, right? So it just takes the direction of this arrow and reverses it. Okay, we can see that there's an additional neuron in this network, so it must have hit the split command, split, change, split, change, and so on. So by hitting these different variables, it's expanding and building this neural network. Now, it may be, well, it is the case in this formal grammar that the actual strings that are constructed are mixtures of body commands and brain commands. So for example, let's take a brain command. Let's make a variable, let's make a sentence that starts with F. So we create, for example, the single bar that you see in panel A. The turtle keeps going, and now it hits let's say the duplicate command. So we had a null robot. The turtle created a single bar. Inside that single bar, we place this minimal neural network in panel A, and the turtle then duplicates that edge that it's sitting on, and so on. So as we move along the string produced by the formal grammar, the robot is building the robot's body and brain at the same time. Make sense? Okay. Okay, so again, in the formal grammar, we're sort of throwing all the body and brain variables together. So the turtle points at any one time to a particular place on the robot's body, a particular body part, and a particular place in the neural controller, which is an individual synapse in the brain. If a joint element is called, this is telling the turtle to create a joint to connect the body part it's sitting on and a neighboring part, connects those pieces together. We also tell the turtle to execute output 1, which connects the current part of the neural network to the joint that was just created. So for example, let's say that the turtle is sitting here, and the next command that it encounters in the string is joint, then the turtle will connect two objects together with a joint, and it will take this synapse, pull it off of C, and connect it to the joint. It's motorizing the joint. We need to connect body and brain together. Okay, I don't need you to remember all of these details, but just to get the basic intuition here about what we're doing. Remember that I mentioned that this is also a parameterized or a parametric L system. So what is a parametric L system? What that means is that on the for the predecessors, we're introducing this additional parameter here, or actually we're also introducing it for the variables. So we can now say if we encounter the variable A, but the current parameter for A, let's say this is A8, 8 is greater than 1, apply this successor. If we encounter the variable A, but the parameter associated with A is 0, so let's say we're moving along the string and we hit A0, 0 is less than 1, we replace A0 with A0 itself. This should look familiar to you, right? We're introducing recursion here, and this is our base case. So when we encounter a parameterized variable, we can replace it with other parameterized variables conditioned on the current value of the parameter. Why introduce this additional detail? It gives us recursion. Why is that important? Our little text snippet here actually tells us. By having these parameters, we can create, is a class of L system with production rules have parameters and algebra. Parameter values can also be used to determine which production rules. I've lost it here. Where are we? So what can happen is, in this case, we can produce, when we introduce parameters, we don't get just a single string from a starting string. We can get families of strings. So if we start with A4, we get this progression, and we end up with this final string. We know this is our final string because we have all zeros here. If we had started with a starting sentence of A5, we would get a string that has a similar pattern to this, but would also be different. So we can produce families of final strings from the same starting string with different parameters. And you'll see this when we look at some of these robots. Here we go. The advantages of this are we can produce these families of structures. So we can create different variations on the same theme. So I won't go into the details, but here you can actually see two production rules from the Lindenmayer system that is evolving these robots. We can see here are some of the commands that change the neural network. We can't see any here that change the body, but they could be in there. Okay. All right, as usual, I've saved the best for last. Here are some of the robots that were produced by these production rules. Tell me about these robots. They justify why we've gone to all these lengths to create this very complex genotype to phenotype mapping. Are these random collections of bars? So like the Cantor dust or the branching trees that we saw before, we actually have repeated structure. So you can see that there is symmetry in here, repeated structure, and we can also get fractal structure. We get certain patterns that were repeated at a smaller scale at different parts of the body. Right? Turns out that most biological organisms also have fractal structure, right? So at the base of your circulatory system, you have large branching structure. Out towards the capillaries, you also have branching structure, but at a smaller scale. There's self-similarity in our bodies and our brains as well, and you see that showing up in the robots here. I think I can play these for you, hopefully. There we go. Okay, again, this was early work just when physics engines were getting going, so this was a somewhat crude physics engine, but I think you can see what's going on here. Do you have regularity only in terms of the body? I haven't shown you the neural networks yet. How do you know there's regular structure in the neural networks as well?
They have regular movements as well.
They have regular movements as well, right? So let's focus on this snake robot up in the upper left here. It clearly has symmetry and repeated pattern in the body. We can see it. We can imagine that if this robot had a random neural network, it would be thrashing all over the place, and there'd be no rhyme or reason to its movement. But we have this traveling wave along the length of its body, which is being produced by a neural network that also has repeated neural subcircuits along the length of the body. Right? So our turtle is producing Cantor dust in terms of the body, repeated structure in the body, and also repeated structure in the brain, which has made it easier for evolution to discover this particular type of locomotion, which we've seen many times now. What is this called? Peristalsis, right? It's one of the first modes of locomotion that Mother Nature discovered in biological organisms. And as we've seen now in 3 or 4 completely different evolutionary robotics experiments, artificial evolution discovers, given the chance, the same kind of motion pattern. Okay. Final slide for this lecture. Again, we have evolutionary time on the horizontal axis here and fitness on the vertical axis. They're reporting just one run here of the generative or the L system that I just showed you. And they then ran a control case here, which is a generative control case. So what they did in this control case is they kept the turtle graphics. They kept the turtle, but they threw away the Lindenmayer system. So now, in the generative case, the genotype is this starting sentence and production rules. In the control case, the genotype is just a random collection of variables, body and brain variables. A mutation could choose an individual variable in the string and replace it with some other random variable. So in the control case, they're evolving a sequence of commands directly for the turtle. In the generative case, they're evolving a Lindenmayer system, which produces a string which controls the behavior of the turtle. And as you can see here, the control case, evolving these strings directly, produces much worse robots. Which is good news for the authors, because they've gone to all this work to create this very complex genotype to phenotype mapping. It clearly had an advantage. What is it? You can see some of the robots that are produced by this control case down here. What's the difference between these robots and these robots?
The control cases have disjoint body parts.
They have disjoint. There's no real regular patterns, right? There's no symmetry in here. There are no clearly defined repeating patterns, right? You have a random collection of body parts, and you can imagine that the brains of these robots are also random collections of neurons and synapses without any regular patterns in them. If you have a very asymmetric robot, it's going to be very hard for evolution to figure out how to get this robot to move quickly in a straight line. So clearly, symmetry and repeated patterns are useful. This was discovered back in 2001 when L systems were applied to robotics. It was rediscovered several years later in an evolutionary algorithm that we looked at a few weeks ago. We looked at an evolutionary algorithm a few weeks ago that also biased evolution to favor regular patterns, repeating patterns, symmetry. What was that evolutionary algorithm? HyperNeat, right? Remember what HyperNeat does. The genotype paints regular patterns either onto an array of pixels or regular patterns inside three-dimensional space or regular patterns of synaptic weights inside of a neural network. So we can create evolutionary algorithms that favor the production of regular patterns in our robots, and that clearly makes things easier on the evolutionary process. Okay. However, that hopefully you're thinking to yourself, well, that's all well and good, but why don't I just create a robot that has regular pattern? Why don't I create a quadruped which has radial symmetry, right? Each leg has exactly the same pattern as all the other legs. It was relatively straightforward for you to create a symmetric robot create a symmetric quadruped in Pyrosim. Why let evolution rediscover symmetry and repetition and so on? Why don't we just build the body and let evolution or a learning system train the brain? So we're going to switch now into lecture 25 and look at a paper I wrote a few years ago to try and provide an answer to why you would want to evolve bodies. We've now looked at 2 or 3 different attempts to show you how to do it, but it still doesn't really answer the question of why. We've learned along the way of doing this that symmetry and repetition is useful. Why don't we, now that we know that, why don't we just build robots that have symmetry and repetition? Okay, so lecture 25, why evolve bodies in the first place? I'm going to start this from I'm going to start answering this question in an indirect manner. I'm going to start by introducing one aspect of biology that we haven't touched on too much yet. Sam might have talked about this in his guest lecture, this concept of biological development. Right? So here's our little cartoon to show how this works. Biological DNA does not dictate a body plan and a brain. So I've talked about DNA as a blueprint. That's actually not a good metaphor. A better metaphor for DNA is a recipe. Take these things, combine them together over time in this way. Right? Your DNA doesn't actually encode blue eyes or brown eyes. Your DNA encodes very complex or orchestrates the movements of proteins that in the end result in blue eyes or brown eyes. Right? So we have DNA which is evolving over evolutionary time, and any DNA that shows up in any given organism dictates how that organism changes from single cell to senescence or death, right? What is the process of change over time? So what we're going to look at now is what we sort of tongue-in-cheek call Evo-Devo-Robo. So Evo-Devo, this is a sub-branch of study in evolutionary biology, which studies the evolution of development. So here's development, an organism that's developing or changing over time, and the recipe that dictates that developmental trajectory, that recipe itself is changing over time. The topmost panel here is showing that we actually sort of have three major time scales at work in any biological system. We have the slowest phylogenetic time scale, the Evo part, right? We've spent quite a bit of time talking about that. We have the middle time scale, which we haven't really looked at yet, Devo, so a robot or an organism which is changing, whose body and brain is changing over its lifetime. And at any instant in time, the organism or robot is also changing its body and brain by moving and responding in real time to its environment. Slow, medium, and fast change. Right? These faster dynamics or phenomenon like phototaxis or object manipulation, they emerge out of these dynamics that are occurring at slower time scales. So what I'm going to show you is why we might want to evolve morphology, because it involves this process of development, why this is important. Okay, so let's have a look at this. What I'm going to show you in this experiment is one experiment which is going to incorporate the developmental time scale into our traditional evolutionary robotics experiment, which is going to be our control case here. And I've named these two different experiments morphological scaffolding and no morphological scaffolding. Let me bring up the videos here to show you how this works, to explain this idea of morphological scaffolding. Which I may or may not be able to play for you. Okay, we're lucky today for some reason. We can do this. Okay, so let's work through the control case first. We've seen this now many times before. We're going to evolve this robot, which for the moment has a fixed morphology. We're evolving phototaxis, so move towards the block to the far left there, and what you're watching is generation 0. We're just running through a population of random controllers. Robot isn't doing a very good job, right? Kind of what we would expect. After a while, I was able to evolve this gait. Not the best quadrupedal gait, but not too bad. And the robot approaches the light source. So this is Evo-Robo, right? We're evolving the neural controller for this robot. Okay. Now I'm going to incorporate this idea of development by starting with a robot that's slightly different. So now we've got a robot in which the legs are all arranged horizontally. So it's starting by lying on the ground. And again, I'm showing you generation 0. We're just iterating through random controllers. How are these robots doing?
Not all that well.
Not all that well. Can I play both of these at the same time? Oops, sorry. Ah, cool. How are these robots doing compared to these robots? A little bit better. There's a little bit of potential there. If you watch carefully, there are a few in here that actually manage to move further, maybe not towards the block, but definitely we're getting more displacement than the ones at the top. Why?
There's no friction in it.
There is friction. Definitely there's friction. Which here is a good thing, not a bad thing.
It's pushing stuff off the ground. So the second one has more surface area interacting with the ground. It's not as more to the top of the first one.
There's definitely more friction in this case than this one.
The drawings are more simple movement.
It's a simpler movement, right? So the one that's upright, a lot of these are actually falling over. I think it's actually cutting off the ones that fall over, right? We have a much more unstable robot in the top left than the bottom left. So there's many more combinations of movements, even random movements down here that get some displacement. So using this body plan, after a little while, this gate evolved, which again, not the most ideal gate, but it does get the robot to the target object. It turns out that we were able to achieve this level of fitness in many fewer generations than in this case. Why? This population of controllers are more evolvable on this robot than a similar population of controllers on this robot. Why is it easier for evolution to animate this robot than this robot? It's easier for it to perfect a simple movement, right? So it gets some sort of rowing movement that gets the robot moving, and then subsequent mutations over a few generations change the direction of travel to get to the target object. So another way to think about this is that in this case, evolution has to solve two problems at the same time. Displacement, move towards the target object, and balance, don't fall over. Right? Remember our discussions about bipedal locomotion. Very difficult task because any mutation to a robot that happens to already move 3 or 4 paces, most of those mutations are going to cause the robot to fall over. Right? Not in this case. So we have actually made things easier for evolution by giving evolution a different body to get started with. Remember, this lecture is about trying to answer this question, why evolve the body plan? Why evolve bodies along with brains? Well, it turns out that certain bodies make things easier for evolution or harder for evolution to evolve a controller that produces the behavior you want. So you remember we mentioned this term scaffolding a while back. Scaffolding is the idea of a parent that's holding the child's hand and is actually walking the child through the process of walking so that the child starts to get the basics of an idea, right? Scaffolding is the idea that there is some helper that's making the job of the learner easier, helping the learner to get started. And then once the learner starts to get started, you take the training wheels off the bicycle. Right? We can do that in the environment. For example, if we want to evolve phototaxis by putting the object close to the robot, then gradually moving the light source further away. We can make changes to the environment to produce scaffolding. Here, we were demonstrating that the morphology itself can provide scaffolding. If you want to learn how to move, one of the best ways to do it is start by staying close to the ground. Okay. I think we will pause there and continue this discussion on Thursday. You have a quiz due tonight, and you're carrying on with your final project. Good luck.
Thank you.